this Chinese model of governance, which is supposed to be so wonderful, is actually very self-serving. And when push comes to shove, power preservation is much more important than public protection.
U.S. lawmakers blast China for human rights abuses.
Everybody is reluctant to criticize China. The government has now detained roughly 1 million of them, probably more, for forced re-education, which in essence means, until you abandon Islam, until you abandon your culture, until you speak Mandarin, until you worship Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party.
Death toll from the outbreak continues to climb in China. New cases surged by double-digit percentages in 11 days.
It is still a regime that focuses foremost on itself. And that has come through with this coronavirus outbreak. And so you see these horrible scenes coming out of a handful of hospitals in Wuhan, and they're utterly overwhelmed. People are begging, they're sort of sitting in lines, waiting and waiting and waiting, hoping to be treated, probably infecting each other in the process.
Which is just a further push on human rights in your mind?
Oh, it's a human rights disaster.
And I think that, we have a duty to engage in a battle.
100 years from now, Kenneth, do you think that we will be living in a place where human rights are generally respected, or do you think this will always be a battle?
You're always going to need a human rights movement to fight back. But I keep doing this because I see over and over how this kind of struggle makes a difference.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... Do you believe in human rights? That no matter who you are, no matter where you are, what country you live in, what religion you practice, that you have fundamental rights that you deserve. That's a right to freedom, right to a fair trial, a right to privacy, a right to practice your own religion. Well, Kenneth Roth is the executive director of Human Rights Watch, and he believes that you do have those rights, and they are constantly being violated by people all over the world. And I went deep with Ken, and he really blew my mind about what's happening in China right now, how they're prosecuting the Muslim population, how they're tracking people with digital face recognition technology, giving them barcodes and tracking all of their habits. If this continues at this pace, this could be something we all have to worry about in this world. We went on to talk about Yemen, Israel, even America when it comes to the abuse of human rights on our borders with criminals and also our own privacy. We talked about whistleblowers like Edward Snowden and Julian Assange. This is a very important episode. And if we look at places like China where some of these rights are being violated, it could be a precursor at what happens here in the UK or even in the US. I really appreciate Ken's perspective. This episode will blow your mind as far as what's happening out there, and I know you're going to enjoy this incredible perspective. This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Kenneth Roth, the American attorney, former federal prosecutor, and executive director of Human Rights Watch. With over 450 people in 100 countries, you investigate and report on rights abuses happening in all corners of the world. In 1997, you were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for helping introduce the Mind Ban Treaty, which saved countless lives. You've documented war crimes in Bosnia, Iraq, and Sierra Leone, and you've also done extensive work to end the use of child soldiers. Over the past 4 decades, you've expanded the Human Rights Watch reach, growing the organization 8-fold. Kenneth, welcome to London Real.
Great to be here. By the way, when you say all those yous, that's Human Rights Watch, not me.
Yeah, okay, the collective you, but okay, I appreciate, yeah, that's Human Rights Watch. First off, what's it like being in London? I know you were here, you had a conversation with, I think, AI Weiwei last night. What was that like, and what was it like being in London for you?
Well, it's always great to be in London. I mean, I get here 3 or 4 times a year. We have a big office here. It's obviously a media center of tremendous importance. So it's always fun to come here. The Ai Weiwei conversation was interesting. I mean, I'd met him before. We had done something together in Geneva about a year ago. But this was an hour and a half on stage before 1,700 people. And it was really a conversation. And this is a brilliant, quirky guy. He has this ability in any situation to find some odd take on it that just wakes people up. And for the longest time, I mean, he still is very focused on the repression in China, which is getting so bad that he can no longer live there. But he's also these days focusing a lot more on refugees and really taking a global perspective on things. And it was a great conversation.
Wow. And he knows China just so well because he spent time there, but he also was in New York City for some time and went back, and now he's outside of there. I mean, he's got a real interesting perspective on that place.
Yeah, I mean, what's most interesting is that his father was kind of a major revolutionary figure, a poet, and knew all the founding members of the Communist Party. And so he kind of comes from within the system, knows the system well, for better or worse. And so he sees all the evil that it generates, the repression, the clamping down on people. But he also has seen, as he describes it, its long-term strategy. It's in the West we think a quarter ahead.
Right.
3 months. That's my strategy. Whereas there they think decades ahead. So he's very impressed by that and the Communist Party's ability to adapt. So what was striking to me is that on the one hand, he's an activist. He's constantly pointing out the ways in which the Communist Party serves itself rather than the Chinese people. But he also is a pessimist. And he does this activism not out of a real theory of change, but more just out of a sense of duty. And he's not convinced it's going to make any difference. Wow. So it was, I found myself, almost arguing with him saying, but wait a minute, these are the strategies, these are the ways we can make a difference. And he, kind of kept coming back to, well, this party is so malleable and it's got a long-term perspective. And so it was, that I was taken aback by.
Right, his lack of optimism.
Yeah. But
maybe he should know, or maybe that's his perspective.
That's just who he is,
Right.
But he's an artist. And so, he is very centered on, how do you take this particular situation? Where do you find the absurdity in it that wakes people up to what's going on? And he can do this like no one else, and does it obviously with enormous understanding of China, but also really is now globalizing his perspective. He's just putting on a big film on the Rohingya Muslims who've been chased from Myanmar through crimes against humanity and arguably genocide. He's done a big film recently, Human Flow, on refugees around the world. I think he traveled to 30 different places. It was a massive investment. And he essentially sells his paintings to finance his films. Wow. So it's very impressive.
Wow. Yeah. I wanted to talk about China today, but it's an interesting time to talk about China because it seems like the coronavirus almost magnifies some of the human rights issues in China and brings it all to the surface to where it almost shows the whole world where the problems are.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That is completely true. In other words, the Chinese government tries to sell itself by saying, yes, we're a bunch of dictators, but we're a benevolent dictatorship. We can get things done. Whereas democracy in the West is so messy, they don't get anything done.
Right.
And this is obviously a difficult time to defend democracy, between Brexit and Trump, and there are problems. We have to concede that. But when you look at China, the impressive thing is they've taken 600, 700 million people out of poverty. But it is still a regime that focuses foremost on itself. And that has come through with this coronavirus outbreak. So, the initial reaction, every Public Health 101 says, be transparent, give out information, move quickly, because if you can nip something in the bud, you can save many, many lives. SARS, which was 2003, another coronavirus that broke out in China, they covered it up at first, and it spread around the world. They ended up doing the exact same thing with this Wuhan coronavirus. And there were actually 8 doctors at the outset who said, hey, something's going on here. People are getting this odd new pneumonia. And they were told to shut up.
Right.
And
posted something online, one of them.
Yeah, and they were all chastised. So one of them has actually come down with the virus now. But now they've obviously had to be more open as the virus has spread. But even if you look at how they're responding, they still are trying to limit the social media conversation. They're trying to downplay the scope of it. And they are also responding with this ruthlessness that ignores the individual. So they have locked down 60 million people in Hubei province, the province of which Wuhan is part. And they are essentially locking people in their homes with minimal food. They, one person a day is allowed to go out. But the horrible thing is that if you come down with a fever and you suspect that you have the coronavirus, you've got to beg for an appointment to get tested. And they're so overloaded that you can't get tested. And until you're tested, you can't get treated. So they're kind of forcing people to just stay at home and sometimes die. Wow. And which is partly why the numbers I think are undercounted so far. But it also shows this kind of indifference to the individual, which is telling. I mean, that's just the way China is. And so the same government that has been investing big time in very visible, job-producing projects, the bullet trains, the highways, the high rises. At the same time, they're underinvesting in public health. And so you see these horrible scenes coming out of a handful of hospitals in Wuhan, and they're utterly overwhelmed. People are begging, they're sitting in lines, waiting and waiting and waiting, hoping to be treated, probably infecting each other in the process. Wow. So it shows the way this regime has gone. And it's obviously a big emergency. Anybody would struggle with it, but they would struggle more openly, because the more open you are in a case like this, the more people can save themselves and guard themselves against infection. And
so it's a transparency issue, and the infrastructure hasn't been there as well.
Infrastructure is not there. And of course, this is just the latest thing, but if you look at, how is China responding overall? This is a government that's terrified of its own people. And so Xi Jinping, who is, trying to become president for life, contrary to the Chinese tradition, he has completely shut down civil society, independent lawyers, independent journalists, activists. There just is no more permitted dissent. Even social media, which for a brief period was interesting, it was kind of within the great Chinese firewall, so which was designed to prevent Chinese people from talking to the outside world, but they could talk to each other, and that's dangerous if you're a dictator. So they've now shut that down. And the epicenter of this repression is Xinjiang, the northwestern region, which is home to about 13 million, mostly Uyghur and other Turkic Muslims. And the government has now detained roughly 1 million of them, probably more, for forced re-education, which in essence means until you abandon Islam, until you abandon your culture, until you speak Mandarin, until you worship Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. And so you can imagine how this goes. 1 million adults is, call it 10% of the adult population. Kids are being orphaned and they're shipped off to school for indoctrination. So it is a horrible situation. On top of this, they have built a surveillance state, the likes of which the world has never seen. And Human Rights Watch was actually able to get a hold of these handheld devices that the police use in Xinjiang. And we reverse engineered the app to see, so what information are they collecting? And there are like 11 pages of data on people, some obvious biographic data, but also things like, do you enter your house from the front or the back? Because you enter from the back, that's suspicious. How much electricity do you use? And all these things that they think might be indicative of independence or contact with the outside world. And that is then used to determine who gets detained. And people literally have barcodes on their doors. So the police can just go up and figure out who's there and decide, do you detain the person who's showing up at your checkpoint or not? So this is
sounds like a dystopian movie.
It's totally dystopian. They use, there's a lot of talk these days about facial recognition technology. In Xinjiang, the video cameras are pervasive. It makes London look like, a privacy paradise.
Right, because we have a few here.
Yes, no, exactly. London is notorious for it, but Xinjiang is worse. And they combine this with the use of facial recognition technology, so they can just track you, and all of this data is added into the individualized account that they have for every person, which the police can then access through these devices. And so it's actually it's a feat of big data analysis, because they throw all this data together, but they now are developing the ability to process it, and through this decide who is dangerous in their political terms or not. Wow. And it's obviously super subjective, but the consequence can be detention for indefinite detention, really, until they decide that you are no longer a threat.
Right.
So that's that's what's happening in Xinjiang, and it's just a matter of time before that is spread out throughout China. They've had this thing called the social credit system, which is being rolled out. It's supposed to be implemented by the end of this year. It may take a little bit longer. But the idea is that everybody is assessed currently according to social criteria. You know, are you a good neighbor? Do you jaywalk? Do you take out the garbage? You know, things like that. Yeah. Easy to add political criteria to this. But the idea is to use day-to-day incentives to control people. So, you know, you only need detention in the extreme cases. Most people, you know, if they want access to a passport, they want access to the fast train, if they want access to a good school for their kids, they've got to have a decent social credit score. And if not, they're stuck in the back. And so they try to take, you know, the little things that everybody wants in life and say, you're not going to get it unless you behave according to our criteria. And that, they're going to do that for the whole country.
There's a show on Netflix called Black Mirror, and there was an episode where everyone has their social score above their head when you look at a phone, and you can see who's highly ranked and lowly ranked, and the low ranks are just off the grid, and the high ranks get all the cool parties and all the cool service and everything. And it was scary to people. And now they're putting that into place.
They're putting that into place, and I mean that's going to be all of China. You know, they're not yet at the point where they're, you know, using your Google Glass so you can get the scores. I look at you, but in essence, with these handheld apps, they're going to be able to do that.
So it's not about having money or a passport or being a citizen. It's what that score is, and that score can, like you said, at the extreme be something bad, but you don't need to have the extreme to control people. It's that
most people just want the day-to-day goods of ordinary life.
And this is kind of like what the Stasi used to do by reporting on everyone, but it wasn't necessarily numerified or big dataed. It was like people were spying, okay, this person is doing this. Or
no, you would have a physical file, but somebody would have to go to Stasi headquarters and read it. And it was slow, and it was, you know. Whereas here, it's available to any police officer on the street. And the data is much more comprehensive because they don't rely necessarily on human informants. You can get those as well. But a lot of this is just data that's available through observation.
Right, through the cameras and facial recognition, which is not being debated as a human rights issue in China.
No, I mean, there's no opportunity to. And I mean, we, you know, in the West, I think, are beginning to appreciate the dangers of facial recognition technology because we already, you know, allow ourselves to be tracked by carrying around our mobile phones, which are basically tracking devices. And
big article in the New York Times that was tracking everybody in the city and saying how easy it was to track who you are, even if you're anonymous, because they can see your residence and your work. And just tracking where you are for 24 hours almost identifies exactly who you are.
You can totally figure out who you are. And then, you know, are you seeing a psychiatrist? You know, is there some secret contact you're seeing? You know, I mean, anything becomes apparent through this tracking device. Now, you know, theoretically, you could leave your phone at home, which nobody does. But even then, as these video cameras are spread around and facial recognition technology is developed, they can track you that way as well. And so I think what in the West we're beginning to appreciate is that you know, we're used to thinking of privacy as something that happens at home or in secret, but there's an element of privacy that we all depend on out in public as well. And that is, you know, really the presumption of anonymity that we all have when we go through day-to-day life, particularly in a city. And, you know, yes, theoretically, the police could follow you, but that takes, you know, massive investment of time and person power. But, you know, today, the police can track everybody just through computers. And suddenly, if they can reconstruct your life without any warrant, without any permission, something wrong with that. And so there is this kind of pushback to reassert this, you know, right to anonymity in public. But we need to develop standards like that. It isn't really written out yet. But you know, China shows what happens when you don't develop these standards. But we in the West have got to act before it's too late here as well.
Yeah, and I think we've seen things like Oakland Police Department and a few places like rejecting the use of facial recognition. But it's few and far between. And I mean, the real daddy is the NSA, and you wonder if they're choosing not to do it, it feels like it makes everything else potentially moot.
Well, also the police departments that are rejecting facial recognition technology are mainly acting on the basis of bias, because so far it's quite inaccurate, and sort of the darker your skin, the more inaccurate it is. So it's that kind of bias that people are objecting to. But even if it was 100% accurate, there are big problems, because you do lose this ability to be anonymous, which, you know, I mean, is not an absolute guarantee if you're
Is that a human right?
Well, yes, I would say. In other words, I think it's an element of the right to privacy. And it's a presumptive right. So, if you commit a serious crime, of course they can try to find you. But if you're just leading your ordinary life, they should leave you alone.
Right.
And the government, as well as private companies, shouldn't be able to track you.
Which is why we have the process of getting a warrant, and you have to have probable cause, the judge has to make the decision, and then you can tap into the information.
Except that's not how this works yet.
Right, except it's not.
Yeah.
Just finishing up with China, the way you describe China, it feels like that is 100x more important than any other place in the world right now for you and your organization. Is that inaccurate to say?
Well, Human Rights Watch just did a big report on this. In fact, I was just blocked from Hong Kong because of this.
Just recently, because I knew you were blocked from Hong Kong. Okay.
Yeah. But traditionally, Human Rights Watch does reports on one country or one issue at a time. And once a year, we do a global report. We call it our World Report. And I always write an introduction to it, which highlights an important global theme. And this year, I wrote about the threat that the Chinese government is posing to the entire international human rights system. And the motivation is what we've been talking about here, the domestic repression. But the Chinese government, particularly over the last couple of years, has become very concerned with preventing external criticism of what it's doing. And so there are kind of two
very
big
sensitive to it.
Super
the
sensitive.
NBA and all these people,
Exactly.
It's strange because the population isn't necessarily following the Twitter feed of an NBA star, but when they say something, they shut down the TV rights. I don't know, it surprises me sometimes. How
No, I mean, that's a perfect example. In other words, if you think about it, some general manager in Houston, a guy nobody pays attention to, tweets support for the Hong Kong pro-democracy protesters.
Correct.
And Beijing goes ballistic. And they threaten to shut down the billion-dollar television contract that they have with the National Basketball Association. Now, obviously, suddenly, this guy's tweet, everybody knows about it, where otherwise it would have disappeared.
Right.
So it backfires, as did their treatment of me, but it shows how sensitive they are. And so on the one hand, they're willing to use their economic clout, not simply to censor at home, which has been going on for a long time, but to force companies to censor their employees. And you see this you saw this with Arsenal, you see this with Cathay Pacific. There are a number of companies that have economic interests in China. And word has gone out, if your employees say something positive about Tibet, if they criticize Xinjiang, if they say something about Hong Kong, you're in trouble, your company is in trouble. And so, that's one thing that they're doing. But at the kind of governmental level, the major places where human rights are discussed are still in the United Nations. And China has been investing big time in trying to build alliances to prevent any criticism of it at the United Nations, but actually a step further, to prevent any enforcement of human rights at the United Nations. And so the Security Council is a good example where China actually has a veto. They operate with Russia to prevent any action on Syria, on Myanmar, on Venezuela. And there, the theory is, just let these people rot rather than create a precedent of enforcing human rights that might come back and haunt Xi Jinping and the authorities in Beijing.
Okay.
And they, even in a place like the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva where there is no veto, they rally support really through economic incentives and threats. So this whole Belt and Road Initiative, this $1 trillion development effort that Xi Jinping touts, is, it's known for being kind of no strings attached. Like, unlike the World Bank, you don't have to respect human rights in order to get the money.
Right. This is the investment in Africa and other countries around the world, right?
But there's a huge political condition attached, which is you vote with us at the United Nations. And if you don't, I actually sat down with Imran Khan recently, the Pakistani prime minister, and said, why don't you talk about your fellow Muslims in Xinjiang? And he basically says, I can't. This China owns us economically. Right. We're in trouble, and they're buying us. So they're using kind of economic clout and economic threats to build a group of supporters of the UN. Now, some are willing to do this. If you're a dictator, the last thing you want is human rights enforcement. Right. But there are many democracies that are also kind of going along with China because of this economic clout. And so, we really have been highlighting this threat to the overall system. And part of it is also, as we started off here, showing that this Chinese model of governance, which is supposed to be so wonderful, is actually very self-serving. And when push comes to shove, power preservation is much more important than public protection.
Right. And then they would tell you that power preservation is what preserves order in the public. That's what they would come back and say.
Yeah, and order, yes, but order meaning, no political competition, no alternative to Xi Jinping, no free discussion. And so, even 5 years ago, there was much more public debate, there was much more emphasis on the rule of law, there was kind of emerging civil society. That's all gone.
Gone. And is it a sign of weakness, in your opinion, when they have that kind of visceral reaction to some manager in Houston? Because if they had the power, they might ignore it. Or are they so concerned that they're on the edge now of a revolt or the information getting out?
No, I think it comes from a sense of insecurity on their part.
Right.
And they are very conscious of the demise of the Soviet Union. And they, kind of wake up every morning and say, what did the Soviets do wrong? How are we going to avoid that? And that is their dominant concern. So, if they were strong and, the general manager of the Houston Rockets tweets something, they say, who cares? Come on. But, when they go ballistic over something like that, it's a sign of insecurity. It's also an effort to use their newfound economic strength.
Right.
But there's a limit to that. And one of the things we've been encouraging both countries and companies to do is to band together. Because, China likes to basically, attack people one by one, because then it's the big heavyweight versus some, Denmark or whatever. But if you get governments that band together, they can't cut off economic relations with everybody.
Okay.
And so we've been doing that. We encouraged about 24 governments at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva to issue the biggest really collective condemnation of what's going on in Xinjiang. And nothing like this had happened before, but they felt safety in numbers and they finally did it. But to give a sense of how scared governments were, the tradition in Geneva is that when you issue a joint statement, then one of the signatories stands up before the Human Rights Council and reads it. Nobody would do that. So they just submitted it in writing. And that just showed the fear. Now, a few months later, we orchestrated the same thing at the UN General Assembly in New York. And then finally, it was actually Britain that came forward and said, okay, we'll read this. So, progress. But it just, that initial reaction showed the fear that governments have. But it's important to respond collectively because, otherwise China's going to prevail here. And it's interesting watching the reaction to something like this too, because, you'd say, oh, what does China care? Just, a couple dozen countries get together. But they were really bothered by this. They immediately orchestrated their own counterstatement of about 50 governments. But it was, the thugs of the world. It was North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Russia, So it was not exactly the highest moral authorities that came to China's defense. But they've also been organizing these show tours of Xinjiang and saying, look, everything's fine. All these Uyghurs, they're singing happy songs and they're, you can imagine, you're stuck in some prison and they come in and say, you better smile here or else you're in big trouble. So people play along. But even the journalists who've gone in have been able to talk to Uyghurs privately in the midst of these show tours and get a sense of the ugly reality there. But China is making an effort to defend the indefensible. And that's one step toward actually ending this conduct.
Okay. I'm guessing when they look at the Soviet Union, they realize it ultimately failed because of economic reasons. That is what kind of brought it down in the end. And they're probably making sure that doesn't happen to them.
Yeah, and that, that's a big question because obviously China has grown economically. They like to focus on GDP, gross domestic product, which is, an indicator, but it doesn't necessarily say how the people on the bottom are living. Right. And they don't really want you to assess that, because a lot of people are left behind in the countryside. It's more the coasts and the cities that are doing well. But the other question is, as power is centralized in China, can you really manage this vast population, 1.2 billion people, through increasingly the decisions of one man, Xi Jinping? This is how mistakes are made. And, China has benefited so far through, urbanization, which has boosted the economy, through, the hard work of the Chinese people, through, global trade in cheap goods, and also through massive borrowing and these infrastructure projects that borrowing permits. And it's not clear that they can continue. They may be bumping into the end of this. They have an aging economy. The urbanization has largely happened now. They're trying to move to a kind of a higher category of goods, which you tend to need more freedom of thought and exchanges to succeed in. That's not the Chinese style. So they are, it's not clear they're going to be able to maintain this growth rate. But Xi Jinping is terrified of this because, if they can't keep borrowing, if there's something that's a limit to, the mounting debt, are they going to can sustain the 6% growth rate?
Right.
And if they can't, do the Chinese people start saying, well, wait a minute, I thought the deal was, we keep getting richer and therefore we delegate all our governance authority to you, but you're not keeping your end of the deal. So that's what terrifies them.
Right, which means he's out of a job, maybe communism is out of a job, maybe it turns into chaotic capitalism, who knows?
Yeah, who knows? Well, and if you look at Hong Kong, part of why they're so fearful of Hong Kong is because, these are Chinese people after all. And, the people of Hong Kong have gotten exercised because they were supposed to have the benefits of the one country, two systems agreement that Britain negotiated with Beijing when they handed over Hong Kong. And Beijing is gradually whittling away at that agreement. So the protests were actually launched because Hong Kong wanted to adopt an extradition law that would permit Hong Kong Chinese to be sent to the mainland where there is no due process, there is no judicial independence. People went crazy. This would just shut down the freedoms in Hong Kong because anybody could be arrested and brought across the way. So, these are Chinese people who want their freedoms.
Yeah.
And that's a terrifying thought to Xi Jinping.
I'm impressed how hard they protest. They really believe in this.
Yes, and it's been, now over 6 months.
Yeah.
And they still periodically can turn out, hundreds of thousands of people. And so...
because they know what's happening in China, and they know how bad it can get.
They totally know.
And they're willing to risk their lives for these protests.
Yeah, it's very impressive how deeply the Hong Kong people want their political freedoms.
Yeah, very much. Yeah. Because these are people that are well off, that have potential good futures, that might be able to leave the country, and that they're really willing to sit there and fight for that city-state. It's impressive.
It's very impressive.
And it must drive the Chinese government crazy because every protest is a symbol, to the rest of the country that something's not right and that people want their freedoms.
Yeah. Now, the irony is this world report that I described, which was focusing on China's kind of global threat to human rights, I was going to release that at a press conference in Hong Kong.
When was this, a year ago?
No, this was 3 weeks ago.
3 weeks ago,
yes.
Oh wow.
And I'd done, less than 2 years ago, I'd done a press conference in Hong Kong releasing another Human Rights Watch report on gender discrimination in the job market in China. And it was completely uneventful. I held it at the Foreign Correspondents Club. I went around the city talking to journalists, no big deal. It was a free city. And I flew back this time and they blocked me at the airport. And they just were too afraid at this stage to allow this to go forward. And they totally shot themselves in the foot because their blocking me was this huge media event. And so I just went back to New York. It was like a long weekend of flying Cathay Pacific.
What does that feel like when you get blocked? Does it feel a little weird, scary?
Not scary, no. I wasn't fearful for myself, but it was
They didn't put you in a
disappointing.
room or anything?
Well, no, I did. I went up to the immigration officer. My name immediately popped up in the computer. They put me on some alert. He filled out a restricted form, and they sent me into a back room. And so during my 4.5 hours, I was basically guarded by 3 immigration officers. I was given this kind of perfunctory interrogation. And then, they told me they were sending me back. And so it was...
That sounds a little scary.
Well, it's funny. I at first asked...
Can you record that? Is there anything you can do for your own safety?
Well, I had my phone.
Okay.
So I was in touch with colleagues. So
Okay.
I wasn't really worried. They weren't going to do anything to me. But I asked 2 things. I said, so who's making this decision? Hong Kong or Beijing? And they said, oh, Hong Kong. But the next morning, Beijing punctured that cover story by kind of admitting that they had made the decision. At first I said, well, so why am I being sent back? And all they would say is immigration reasons. Immigration reasons, I couldn't get past that. But then there were sort of these series of explanations that were offered. The first one was that, I was inciting the Hong Kong protests. As if the people of Hong Kong need me to tell them to defend their democracy, or as if I have the capacity to mobilize 1 million people in the streets of Hong Kong. So that was a little odd. And then we went back to New York and held a press conference at the United Nations, which, because of what China had just done to me in Hong Kong, was like a big publicity thing for the release. So every journalist in New York showed up, and it was this massive thing. But a Chinese diplomat showed up too. And the Chinese mission in New York, they never talked to the media. So the journalists were thrilled that this guy shows up. So we handed him the microphone. And he explained then that the reason they blocked me was first because I was not giving them enough credit for the progress they've made. And, of course I asked, which progress is this? The million detained in Xinjiang, or the suppression of the Hong Kong protesters, or, but that was a separate issue. But then kind of the truth came out. And if you look at what you just said today at this press conference, where I described this Chinese threat, that's why we blocked you. So it was just, it's just censorship.
So they need some PR help a little bit.
But but the one thing I did, which is sort of almost a tribute to Ai Weiwei, come back to him. But my staff wanted me to do a selfie video as while I was in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I saw it.
And but I was guarded the whole time, so I really couldn't do it. And they were putting me back on the plane, and they were actually holding the plane. I was the last person to get on the plane. And so I said, as I was sort of right in the gateway, I need a moment of privacy. And so they said, okay, and they backed off. And so I pulled out my phone and did this 1 minute, one take selfie video, which, it is what it is. But then the most stressful part was trying to send it, because I had a kind of a loaner phone, which was not working very well. It would connect to the terminal Wi-Fi. It wouldn't connect to the phone system. And I was losing the terminal Wi-Fi as I walked down the gateway. And so I was trying to send this selfie, watching the bar move slowly along. And I wasn't sure if it was sent, And it was and I was slow walking my way down the gateway, and they're trying to push me along because the plane is waiting. And finally it made it. But that was the most stressful part. Do I get this thing out? And that stupid video has now been seen by 430,000 people. It was retweeted on my Twitter account, I think 14.5 thousand times.
It's amazing because it's real, and it was in the moment. It's how you felt, and and that's a little Ai Weiwei tribute as well.
Yeah, so it was, but that was sort of the somewhat funny part of the whole thing.
Wow. And I mean, now you go back to America, this is a country that depends on China for trade. We're going to see that be stressed now with what's happened with the coronavirus in a big way. How do you deal with the fact that, big business wants to keep trading? Companies like Apple need them. I'm sure, Trump signed the trade agreement, and maybe human rights isn't necessarily on their agenda. How do you deal with those conflicting?
Well, I should say, first of all, Human Rights Watch doesn't oppose trade with China. We rather insist that the trade be done in a way that's respectful of human rights. So, for example, nobody should be using components that are made in Xinjiang by forced labor there, because these people are detained. They're being stuck in factories, and these are coercive situations. So, every business operating in China should insist on guarantees that their supply chain doesn't include Xinjiang forced labor. And I'm not sure if they can at this point, but we ask those kinds of questions.
Okay.
But the problem is that, Trump, he's been tough on China in trade terms, but he really could care less about human rights. He instrumentalizes human rights. And so he will sometimes talk about human rights in China the way he sometimes talks about human rights in Iran or Venezuela, but it's a very selective process. You don't hear him talking about, human rights in Israel or Saudi Arabia or, the various, Egypt, Turkey, the various allies who themselves are abusive. So when you have that overt selectivity, there's very little credibility in the US response. And so we've really had to look to other governments who have a more principled approach. But, everybody is reluctant to criticize China. And, one ploy they often use is to say, oh, I did raise human rights. When I met with Xi Jinping or others, we discussed it quietly, And
I think Merkel does that with Russia every time she meets.
Merkel does this with China too.
Right. They talk about natural gas, and then she says, I really think you should work on your human rights. And they're like, okay, we'll see you next time.
But see, the problem is, if you recognize that the ultimate agents of change in any country are the people of that country. So, in China, it's the 1.2 billion Chinese. We on the outside can help them by, creating space for them to operate politically, but we're not going to change China for them. But if a leader shows up and the people of the country see the smiling photo op, they see the contracts being signed, but they don't hear any protest, they feel abandoned. And so the real test of any leader is, can the people of that country hear you? And typically visitors to Beijing are not heard. And so it does no good. Xi Jinping is perfectly happy to have, some foreign ministry official in the back room of the foreign ministry, issue some complaint, because nobody hears it. And you see this problem with many leaders. You know, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is notorious for this. You know, he even when he's speaking publicly, he has this preference for the passive voice. He doesn't believe in naming perpetrators. You know, there were abuses in this country. You know, we have serious concerns about what's happening there. He never says who did it. And of course, when nobody feels the heat, when the people of the country don't know that the UN Secretary General or some other leader stands behind them, they feel abandoned rather than emboldened. And that's, you know, we got to change that if government officials are going to make any difference on human rights.
That seems like that's standard operating procedure at the UN. It feels like it always will be.
Well, it doesn't have to be.
Okay.
You know, there's this odd concept of diplomacy, which is very old-fashioned, that you never mention anybody. You know, these diplomats have this amazing ability to turn, you know, this leader X murdered that person into a person was murdered. You know, and it's just they have this preference for the passive voice, which is supposed to be diplomatic, but it's just an abdication of responsibility. So that's something, you know, we at Human Rights Watch don't let them get away with. Okay. And when they resort to that, we point it out. And it's usually terribly embarrassing. I mean, you'll have this, you know, briefing by some, you know, UN humanitarian official or whatever to the Security Council, and they never say who did what. It's just, you know, there's this problem and there's that problem, but there's never a perpetrator. And if nobody feels the heat, there's no pressure to change.
Okay. Other countries that you're looking at right now, I'm guessing names like Saudi Arabia come up, Israel, Iran, Venezuela, what else?
I mean, all of the above.
All the above, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, a list of them,
you know, maybe,
all for different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, no, everyone for different reasons. You know, maybe one place to start right now, because it's an acute emergency, is Idlib province in northwestern Syria. Okay. And not that many people focus on this, but today, Russian and Syrian bombers are threatening 3 million civilians in Idlib, who are now huddled along the Turkish border, which is closed. And this could become a new refugee crisis because, you know, Turkey has already taken in, say, 3.5, almost 4 million refugees. They're not going to take another 3 million without opening up the Aegean, and Europe is going to have a new refugee crisis. Wow. So the stakes are extremely high, not to mention the potential bloodshed on the ground. And the key to stopping this is Putin. Putin can turn it on and off at his will. But European governments have not really been talking about this very much. And they are, you know, kind of staring a disaster in the face unless they act and put pressure on Putin. So that's a big issue right now that is not getting the attention that it needs. Erdogan, the Turkish president, is making some effort to stop this advance, but he's very much alone. And there's surprisingly little European support to him. Okay,
and Putin's and the Syrian are bombing some of these areas?
Exactly.
Right, the New York Times has done some articles of proving that they bombed hospitals. And
yes, that's
like
how they do it. In other words, this bombing, it's either, you know, indiscriminately across civilian areas, or where they get targeted, they bomb hospitals. And the hospitals are literally underground to try to protect
That blew
themselves.
my mind. So they build them underground.
They build them underground. And what they were doing is they were sharing the coordinates with the UN as a form of protection. The UN would then give them to the warring parties, and Russia would use these as target lists. So,
and they do that because they're going to squeeze Europe with this crisis. It's always maybe a political reason they're doing
Russia would be happy for Europe to have a refugee crisis because, you know, that's how its allies rise. I mean, why is Viktor Orban, you know, pursuing his so-called illiberal democracy in Hungary? It's by, you know, fighting against this influx of migrants and asylum seekers. And so, you know, Russia actually would love to have another refugee crisis in the West. But they also want things from the West. They want Ukraine sanctions lifted. They want ordinary economic relations. And so the West has considerable leverage there. It's just not using it.
Right. Because a lot of people say, why would they bomb hospitals? But they do it because this is all a political chessboard.
Well, it's also, I mean, it's worth stressing that hospitals are protected by the Geneva Conventions. You know, the Geneva Conventions say that medical care, even for combatants, is protected. And so to bomb hospitals is a war crime. But Putin and Assad, the Syrian president, are essentially pursuing the so-called total war approach, where they're just going to kind of devastate the other side. Who cares about the Geneva Conventions? And you know, bombing hospitals means that an injured combatant can't get treated. And so even though the Geneva Conventions say that, you know, you're entitled to that medical care, they're just attacking it. And the war has been fought this way all the way along. I mean, Assad and now Putin are notorious for attacking medical care. So that's one big issue.
Okay.
I mean, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, and you know, there's Saudi Arabia at home is a problem because Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, you know, portrays himself as a social reformer, but he wants all of this reform to be dictated from on high. And so, for example, he gave women the right to drive, but the women's rights activists who sought the right to drive are in prison because they demanded that right rather than waiting for the benevolent dictator to give it to them.
Okay.
And so there is,
everything's on his terms.
It's all on his terms. So there's a complete crackdown on independent journalism. That's why Khashoggi was murdered, on any kind of human rights or civic activism. So domestically, in political terms, it's horrible.
He's also cracking down on his own people, his own heads of industry, and
Well, notoriously,
locked them up.
He locked people up in the Ritz-Carlton.
The Ritz-Carlton, right?
And essentially, said, you hand over half of your fortune, or you don't get out of here.
Sounds like a Putin move.
Yes, and it's so he got many billions that way. But the worst thing he's done has been in Yemen. And Yemen today is the world's worst humanitarian crisis. There are between 11 and 13 million Yemeni civilians who are dependent on humanitarian aid. Many of them are on the brink of famine. And this is because the Saudi-led coalition has been over and over bombing civilians, hitting mosques, markets, in one case a school bus, and they've been blockading by air and sea the entire northwestern part of Yemen.
Wow.
And this is, it's a complete disaster.
And Iran is involved as well.
Iran is backing the so-called Houthis, who
Right.
are the rebel force in that part of Yemen who are fighting against the Saudis.
And this recent general Suleiman was kind of involved with the Quds force, and it's a proxy war there between those two.
Qassem Soleimani was, certainly it supported the Houthi in Yemen, but I think what he was more known for was his support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Shia militia that are operating in Iraq and also to some extent in Syria.
Yeah.
And so he had a long history of supporting proxies who would, sometimes attack U.S. troops, would sometimes attack Israel. And so that was, really why he was targeted.
Okay.
But,
so this Yemen crisis is major.
The
Yemen
Yemen crisis,
not being talked about as much.
Well, what's interesting is that because these are blatant war crimes, the Saudis have come under real pressure. And Saudi Arabia is another government that, Western governments are reluctant to stand up to because it has so much money. And they all want to sell arms and so forth.
And oil for a trading partner, it's hard to...
Yes.
Although,
Saudi Arabia has to sell the oil, so it's not as if criticizing Saudi Arabia means they're going to cut off their oil sales to you. But it's more that they want the Saudi purchases.
Okay.
So but the pressure has begun to have an effect. So the Saudi-led coalition involves the Saudis bombing, but the Emiratis, the United Arab Emirate forces, recently, about 6 months ago, announced that they're pulling out of this coalition. And clearly the heat was getting to be too much for them. Sudan, which had been providing 20,000 troops, this new post-revolution government in Sudan, also announced that it was pulling out. So increasingly the Saudis are on their own. They can bomb away. They have no ground troops to speak of. And so they are in some trouble there. And the Yemen crisis continues, but there is a sliver of hope there that the Saudis will have to sue for some kind of peace agreement because they've lost the capacity in any sense to win this war against the Houthis.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.